And joining us now, we've got Randy Pierce, the director of the Mississippi Judicial College for the Ole Miss Law School and former Mississippi Supreme Court Justice. Randy, thanks for coming on.
Yes, sir. Gerard, happy 4th of July to you and the folks there at SuperTalk.
Yes, sir. So I want to tell you, I enjoyed your photos and your chronology of the trip to Omaha. Looks like a lot of fun. It's a big day.
It was incredible. I tell you, we drove up for the first weekend for the Auburn game and then came home, worked last week, and then, look, when they got in the final, we just had to get back there, and it was a wonderful experience.
It definitely was. So wanted to have you on the program today. Appreciate you joining us, as always, to discuss lots of activity going on at the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, it's really been a watershed few days with all these decisions being handed down. And we'll start with the big one last week that originated here in the state of Mississippi, the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, I think is the way it was styled. And that ruling came down, and that really set off a firestorm, really on both sides of that argument.
Yes, sir. And, of course, every June we get to, those of us that are in the judicial branch and our lawyers pay attention to the hand-down list that come out of the U.S. Supreme Court, as we do each week for the Mississippi Supreme Court. So this obviously has been a very active June and a lot of cases that are very significant at this point. You know, as the director of Judicial College, I don't offer commentary necessarily on whether I think those are right or wrong. Yeah. But nevertheless, it's been a busy time for those of us that love to watch the courts.
Yeah, and then yesterday we had this case, EPA, West Virginia. I guess the question I have for you about that, and so what the court ruled is that the EPA had in effect overstepped its authority, and that much of the regulation that it had issued and promulgated really was not within their purview, not within their authority, and that they ruled that this is a matter for the Congress. How do you think that, Randy, may affect this complex of agencies going forward that have really always acted on laws and then produced regulations and rules from those laws? Is this going to rein that in and constrain that somewhat? Could this be applied to the agency complex?
Yeah, it no doubt will impact the executive agency that's at the EPA in this case, and then if we were here in Mississippi, we have executive branch agencies too that operate and develop regulations based on laws that are passed by the legislative branch. And so in this case, although I haven't been able yet to read that opinion, I will soon. But based on what I've read about that opinion, it definitely will have a tremendous impact on what's been happening within the Environmental Protection Agency.
It just feels like that what we've seen is kind of a gridlock, I guess, in government. And as a result, it seems like who's ever in the White House issues a bunch of executive orders, and then those get, of course, directed to the agencies in the administration. And so it's kind of a fine line, a gray area between what is the responsibility of Congress and how much authority do the agencies have. You got to believe we'll see more cases, perhaps. What do you think about that? Are you expecting more cases that might deal with the same subject matter?
I would expect more. When you look at, for example, in Mississippi, and we recently, back during the legislative term, I think either Paul or you or someone had on a senator talking about the certificate of need process here in Mississippi and how that works. And so any type of regulatory enforcement that emanates from a statute certainly would be subject to, I think, in my opinion at least, to review. And so we'll just have to wait and see, and that's the thing about the courts. The courts, generally speaking, are there to call balls and strikes and don't seek controversy, but when it comes to the courts simply just have to make the rulings the best they can. Yeah,
it just seems like that the courts have come more into focus. Again, I believe it's because of this gridlock we have in government really is a function of a fairly closely divided nation. We end up electing folks in the Congress, in the House, and the Senate, in the White House. It's pretty half and half. I mean, the Senate in particular, I think, illustrates that. And so you can't get anything done, and whomever, I guess, is in the White House at that point in time tends to look to the courts to get what they want. Not supposed to work that way, is it?
It's if you go back in time and look at history, when you look at, for example, U.S. Supreme Court confirmations and look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice Scalia, for example, and Justice Ginsburg, they were, substantial numbers of opposite, or what we would consider opposite party or bipartisan support for those candidates because they were both well qualified. And so, sadly, I think, in my view, we're at a point where we tend to look not just at their qualifications, but, have politicized so much in our country that hopefully we can get back to the point where when a president makes those nominations that the Senate in its role of confirmation with advice and consent will focus more on the qualifications as opposed to what they think an ideology would necessarily be, whether it be liberal or conservative. But we're not there yet. We're at a tough point, and it's at the point now where unless you've got a president and a majority in the Senate in the same party, it's hard to get some of these nominations through.
Yeah, really is. So what about Randy, are you familiar with this case that the Supreme Court is now just announced considering a hearing? They announced yesterday, and this is a case in North Carolina dealing with the state legislature's power over elections. Are you familiar with that one?
Yes, sir. Of course, I served in the legislature back a few days ago in the early 2000s, and we dealt with redistricting then. So that I haven't seen the actual cert petition that was granted, but reading what I've read, it appears that that could be a very significant case as well in terms of what the judicial role is in an individual state's redrawing of districts after a census, for example.
Yeah, Moore versus Harper is the style of this particular case, and it looks like the Supreme Court might rely on some precedents, it's being reported, as they take up this case. But I guess the main point here is that we're likely to have something else that's highly controversial coming out of the Supreme Court here.
Yeah, that's probably safe to say, and we most likely will see that in late June of next year.
Yeah. Is it kind of surprising, Randy, that we have so many cases that are so high profile with decisions being handed down in a short period of time? We got the Remain in Mexico case. We got the coach in Washington praying on the field. And of course, we got the Dobbs case. Let's see, there was a couple of other ones in there as well. The EPA case, I think we talked about. But just a lot of big ones in high-profile cases compressed into a short period of time.
That's correct. And, when we look at the differences between the U.S. Supreme Court and Mississippi Supreme Court, in Mississippi, you have a right to appeal, and once you make a ruling by a lower court, the Supreme Court either hears it or deflects it down to our Court of Appeals for a decision. At the U.S. Supreme Court, of course, they grant permission for those cases to be heard. And so, there does appear to be, at least looking at the recent decisions and perhaps the certs that have been granted for the next sitting, definitely a tendency to grant those type of cases. So we'll have to see what the court does in those.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. Are you familiar with the case that the Jackson Women's Health Organization has now filed where they're trying to, I guess, perhaps enjoin the trigger law that is certified and now scheduled to go into effect to try to stop that? And that case, of course, is rooted in an old 1998 case concerning the state constitution. We've got about a minute.
Yes, sir. Definitely familiar with it. Obviously, as the trainer of all judges that will be involved in that, I won't comment on the merits of it.
Yeah.
I do know that the Chief Justice made an appointment to hear that case, and we got some great judges out there, and I know the judge he appointed will do a very thorough job.
Be fascinating to watch. Randy, as always, appreciate you coming on Middays. Take care. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Happy 4th again.
You too, sir.
Right.
Judge Randy Pierce has been our guest here on Middays. We'll step aside.